Hello, students. Welcome. We are going to begin the new phase of the new redesigned course for AP Government. So this go around, we're going to discuss the U.S. Constitution. It is one of the foundational documents that you will need to become very familiar with. In this case, we're going to be exploring the predecessor or the document that preceded the U.S. Constitution as well as the U.S. Constitution itself, and better understand what were the powers and the various features of each and how they differed and why there was a need to revamp and redesign. So let's not forget that from our prior PowerPoint, we discussed certain political philosophers that were instrumental in influencing the Founding Fathers when they designed the new form of government that they embarked on. And here we have John Locke, who was the most influential of the political philosophers in terms of the basic ideas and principles that were incorporated into our Constitution. In particular, don't forget his theory on rights, the unalienable rights, if you will, or inalienable rights, that to right of life, liberty, and property. Also, don't forget his belief in the social contract theory, the idea that there is an agreement between the citizens and the rulers, the citizens agreeing to give up some of their freedoms and rights in exchange for the government protecting those freedoms and rights. Nonetheless, we want to make certain just to sort of remind ourselves about these principles as we then delve into the documents themselves. The first Constitution of the United States was actually the Articles of Confederation. So a lot of students make the mistake of assuming that we began with the U.S. Constitution, and that is not correct. In fact, the Articles of Confederation came to be in large part because the Founding Fathers had had a very, well, say negative or less than ideal experience with a government that had a very strong central governing authority. So they almost went the other extreme, whereby they had a very, very weak central authority, where and the states were really the entities with the most power. And so therefore, it's no mistake then that it's entitled Articles of Confederation, because what they established was a confederacy. It did not work very well, and we're going to delve into here, or look further into why exactly.
Okay, so as Mr. Davila said, we're going to talk about some of the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation and delve into some of the detail of that. It's considered one of our foundational documents now in the new course, so we will be looking at that more carefully. But
in class, to be more specific.
Right.
Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that you understood why we segued right into Shays' Rebellion.
Right.
It was because we're going to discuss the Articles of Confederation more in depth in class, so my apologies.
Yeah, so we'll see that Shays' Rebellion is sort of, in some ways, maybe the last straw, or as they say, the straw that broke the camel's back, because many people saw the shortcomings of the Articles of Confederation, and there were many calling for, changes in the Articles before they actually embarked on the change. But Shays' Rebellion really brought home the need for reform in a lot of people's mind, because basically what happened is in Massachusetts, a lot of farmers were struggling economically, as many people throughout the country were at the time. They were losing their farms because of inability to pay taxes, and so their farms were being they were facing foreclosure, and they wanted the state to intervene and pass some laws to either forgive their debts or give them some sort of help in that area. When the state refused to do that, farmers led by Daniel Shays, that's the name. Daniel Shays was a former Revolutionary War officer, captain, and he led a group of farmers and citizens in open revolt against the government of Massachusetts. And they went around, basically, committing lawless acts. They seized arms and they went into courthouses and shut down court proceedings where foreclosures were taking place and destroyed some of the deeds on their farms and so forth. So they were in open rebellion. And normally you would expect, well, the federal government would do something in that case if we had that situation today to quell that rebellion. They did, in fact, the leaders in Massachusetts called on the federal government for aid, and very little was done. The federal government did ask the states to raise troops to address this problem, but I believe basically every state, maybe with the exception of one, was not willing to provide troops. They did not see it as their problem. States saw themselves, were much more interested in their own affairs. Anyhow, so they ended up finally having to raise a private army paid for by, I believe, some of the wealthy citizens of Massachusetts to raise their own army to put down the rebellion. So what this shows was really the lack of power of the central government to quell this rebellion. And, it really raised fears, especially amongst, who has the most to lose, those with property and wealth. And this was sort of a wake-up call for many people who realized that something must be done to strengthen the central government.
And allow me to quote John Green here: when rich people get scared, things happen and things get changed. I think it's worth noting here, because we'll definitely discuss how or why there was this huge movement to change things, and that there were actually things were actually achieved. It was in large part because those who were influential and the moneyed interests and the elites, of which many of our founding fathers were in that group, they were indeed the ones who were affected, or possibly affected, or were fearful that they would be touched by these problems. I want to suggest as well, one of the problems here, as Mr. Phillips pointed out, was that it highlighted the inadequacy or ineptitude of states to be able to deal with even some of their own problems. In other words, that there was really moments when states could not adequately address or deal with their issues, either within their own boundaries or as between each other. There were skirmishes between the states economically, also territorial disputes. And so while we'll go over this in class later, I want to underscore the problems that were existent already under the Articles of Confederation.
Okay, so as a direct result, and among that was one factor among many that finally compelled the Congress to call a convention to be held in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, and the specific purpose of that convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation, or really to make proposals that would call for revisions in the Articles. And of course, what we know historically is that it turns out to be something quite different, in that at the convention, instead of just revising the Articles, they basically scrap the Articles and write an entirely new constitution. So we're going to look at a little bit at that process. Before we get into that, let's just quickly go over some systems of government that existed at the time, and that the founders understood at that time. So this gives you a quick summary of the three main types of government that we usually use to classify, the systems of government. One, you can see autocracy. Some of the information on this is this poster here is not fully accurate, so don't spend a lot of time looking at that, because it says Barack Obama is an example of representative democracy. That's not exactly, I wouldn't say that's stated very well, but anyway. Autocracy, so that's a government, ruled by one person, or where one leader dominates the government. You have oligarchy, which is when a few elite leaders run the government and the people at large have very little say in things. And of course, a democracy, where the people essentially run the government directly in some theoretical cases, and then indirectly is what we see, in the modern world. what we would call also a republican government or republic. And this is just referencing historically, autocracy has been the most common form of government or oligarchy. But in today's world, most governments in the world, the majority of governments in the world, would be classified as some type of representative democracy or a republic.
And I would just add here for students, it is often forgotten or overlooked that ours is a republic and not a democracy, in fact, in terms of how our government was set up. And it's a really important distinction to understand. And republic essentially ensures that you have representatives, REP, REP. If you look at the beginning of the word republic and you look at how the word representative is spelled, make that association, because those kinds of mnemonic devices can be helpful in remembering terms and what they mean. All right, so at the Constitutional Convention, you really had, delegations from the various colonies. And again, they were only...
States.
Yes, states. They were, sorry, at this point, states, that's correct. They were only supposed to revise the articles, but it was clear to, Madison and Hamilton and others, that the Articles of Confederation in and of themselves, there was something inherently unsustainable about that arrangement or form of government. So they really had to start anew. So as you can see here, the delegates were elected, or really selected, and George Washington was elected, I should say, to preside over the convention. And I want to stress here, because we don't really give ourselves over to whitewashing history. I think it's a disservice when people do that. But I do believe it's worth pointing out that of the people who were in the United States at that moment in time in history, George Washington was uniquely situated to be the one to preside over this convention. And I think it's not hyperbole or exaggeration to suggest that but for his presence, we may not have had a constitution, a U.S. Constitution at that moment in time. And the reason I say that is that George Washington was the only person that had a nationwide profile and that everyone knew or heard of or knew something about and respected. And that was important given the fact that you essentially had 13 colonies, now 13 states, that had been running themselves as almost as independent countries. And so, and a lot of these communities were very isolated or self-sustaining, so they didn't really have awareness well beyond their own geographic boundaries. Therefore, when looking at an exercise, or if you will, the enterprise of devising a government that would then rule over an entire nation, all of these what were formerly separate states, now under this one union, under this federal republic, really, there were only, in this case, George Washington fit the bill perfectly in terms of being the right person at the right time for this particular job. And it goes without saying that many times throughout the convention, various delegates left from various states, and they were at the point of perhaps dissembling. And in other words, George Washington's presence was really critical in keeping the group together and finally generating a constitution.
Okay, so we're going to look at a few ideas that the framers agreed upon. So, the men at the Constitutional Convention, as we call it, were not of one mind by any means. They had they disagreed, mightily on many points. But there were some things upon which they agreed. So we're going to look quickly at some of those points of agreement.
So one area that everyone pretty much agreed, remember that I told you before that when rich people get scared, things happen and change. Well, one thing that they had come to the consensus on, remember I told you money, the founding fathers all came from an elite group of landowning individuals. So they definitely saw a need for a stronger national government. However, they disagreed as to how strong that national government or to what degree that national government should be made stronger. The second point is they all agreed on some Republican form of government. It should not be understated that the founding fathers really did not have a lot of trust in handing power over entirely to the people. They really believed and, or if you will, feared the idea of mob rule, that somehow the people could be whipped up into a frenzy and they would sort of lose their wit about them and just start taking things for themselves. So instead, they believed in this idea of having representatives as a filter, if you will, or a step removed, thereby sort of keeping calmer heads prevailing and wiser decisions could be made as opposed to decisions being beholden to emotion. And so you saw here as well, they agreed with Locke's fundamental theory of rights that basically the government's there simply to, if you will, protect or not infringe upon your rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. You can see there was also general consensus around the idea of separation of powers. This meaning that whenever you form a government, do not allow all the powers of that government to be wielded by any one person or any one entity. In particular, we see here Montesquieu's separation of powers being expressed in the various or the three branches of government that we are most familiar with. And here we see the governments of ancient Greece and Rome as being models that the founders appealed to in terms of how they were going to craft this new government. Essentially, we're looking at from Greece the elements, democratic elements that they incorporated into the Constitution, as well as the notion of individuals' rights. And in Rome, we see the structure of a republic that's able to govern a large territory. We also see the English heritage here, limited government focus. In other words, making certain that you delimit what it is that the central government can do. And if you will, identify certain freedoms that the people enjoy from government incursion. So documents like the Magna Carta, as well as the English Bill of Rights, were very influential in how the founding fathers understood and frankly described the limitations of their central government. Finally, the political, or rather not finally, but the political writers of the Enlightenment, of which John Locke, Hobbes, Montesquieu, Rousseau are ones that we've discussed and were very influential in terms of lending ideas and principles that the founding fathers would eventually incorporate into the Constitution.
Okay, so as we mentioned with Locke and, so the Declaration of Independence, obviously they believed in these basic principles that the government exists to protect people's rights and that there must be some voice of the people. You always hear, well, they didn't want a king like the British model, but that doesn't tell the whole story. They also, like as Mr. Davos said, they didn't want to put too much power in the hands of the people. They wanted what they considered to be a balance between those two choices. And of course, they also rested upon some of the things that had worked well at the state level and in the colonial governments, which, you see in those cases, it wasn't unknown to them. They had separation of powers. The states had governors. Most of the states had their own Bill of Rights. And so, and the states defined voting rights. So these things also came into play in the Constitution. So let's, before we look at, so when we get to the convention, basically, we see these two main plans put forth in terms of how the government should be set up. So they spent much of their time at the convention. Once they decided, basically that we need to make, severe revisions, to the Articles of Confederation, basically starting from scratch, that really comes from the Virginia plan. The Virginia delegates, Edmund Randolph, of course, George Washington was from Virginia, and James Madison, who wasn't very well known, but is often called the father of the Constitution because he had such a large role at the convention in terms of helping draft the Virginia plan. So Virginia shows up basically with a full plan for how the government should be changed. Most of the states are caught off guard by this, especially the smaller states, because at the time, Virginia was the most powerful, the largest and biggest economic power in the United States. So Virginia came with a plan to favor the big states. They were not satisfied with the plan under the Articles, where each state was seen as an equal partner. And so, of course, when they've put forth their plan, the small states are furious and totally unwilling to accept it. So the small states rally around the state of New Jersey, William Patterson, and his New Jersey plan, as we call it. So let's quickly delve into what these two states proposed, and we'll see how different these were. And then we'll look quickly at the compromises that were reached. And these are very important, and we'll get into more detail on some of these things. But first off, you see actually that this is one of the similarities we talked about. One thing they both agreed upon was that we needed a separation of powers. We needed 3 branches of government. But we'll see that's about where the similarities end. Now, you don't have to know all these details, but first, let's look at the Virginia plan called for a bicameral legislature. The key here is both houses. So bicameral meaning, 2 chambers, 2 house legislature, but both chambers would have been based on the population of the state. So what we call proportional representation, which was different, in terms of how, the Articles was set up, where each state was represented, by a certain number of delegates, but they all had 1 vote. So in this case, states would get more votes based on the amount of people they had. New Jersey, of course, and the smaller states were just, you can't even emphasize how unacceptable this was to them, because this would have given the big states a huge advantage in making national decisions. And so New Jersey called for a unicameral legislature with equal representation, which would have been very similar to the Articles.
It's worth noting that the New Jersey plan here, with having a unicameral chamber, is very similar to what was had under the Articles of Confederation, where each state would only get 1 vote. You could have several delegates, but at the end of the day, each state only got 1 vote. And you can imagine how the big states thought that this was entirely unacceptable. Why is it that then the most numerous, or the people who, of course, would be part of this country or this nation, be, if you will, ignored in terms of their wishes and will?
So is this going to be a government of the people, a national government, or is this going to be a government of the states, composed as an alliance of states as existed under the Articles? And that's a fundamentally different approach. This is not overly important, but just how it would be chosen. The lower house did have a role in the Virginia plan, where the people played a role. So the people would have a say in the choosing of the lower house. And there's varying interpretations of how the upper house would be chosen, but by the state legislatures is generally what we believe they proposed. Remember, a lot of this was done. It was done behind closed doors and in secret. So some of this we have to gather from the notes that were taken. But New Jersey plan, apparently they wanted the legislature to be chosen by the states themselves, by the state legislatures, which again, there's no direct authority for the people. But it's the national government is meant to represent the states as states. And then you see the final part here. Now the legislative, how are we going to choose the other 2 branches? Under the Virginia plan, the legislature would choose the president and the judges, essentially appoint them, right? But remember, the legislature would be dominated by the big states. So the big states would then also have a much larger voice in choosing the president and selecting judges. Whereas under the New Jersey plan, the legislature would choose the executive and the executive would appoint judges. But remember, every state would have an equal say in that choice.
Let's also not forget the fact that you see both plans place a greater emphasis on the role of the legislative branch, would have definitely been hearkening back in an homage to or recognizing John Locke's proposition, which is of the three branches, the most important, he argued, was the legislative branch because it indeed embodied the will of the people, and that is what should be paid most attention to in terms of the legislation.
Okay, so obviously, I don't know if this music shows up in the YouTube video, but so what decisions were reached in the end? So what compromises were reached in these areas? So we laid out the two plans. So obviously, the first point was already agreed upon. So let's look at the compromises on these other points, and these are very important to understand. The first one, is very, really crucial to understand, which is the Connecticut Compromise or Great Compromise. Basically, Connecticut was sort of a middle-of-the-road state in terms of population. They were positioned to broker such an agreement. Roger Sherman of Connecticut put forth this proposal at the convention that calls for a bicameral legislature. As Virginia had proposed, the key difference is, look at how the two chambers would be set up. The House of Representatives, which they referred to as the lower house, would be based on population, again, meaning proportional representation. The smaller states would have fewer representatives, thus fewer votes and less power, whereas the larger states would have more representatives, more votes, more power. The Senate, however, so obviously the larger states were happy with that setup. The Senate, the upper house, would be based on the notion of equal representation with 2 representatives per state regardless of your population. So, of course, the small states were happy with this arrangement. So, again, a compromise. Neither side gets entirely what they want. They meet in the middle, but both are willing to live with this proposal. Because remember, for any major decisions to be reached in terms of laws, constitutional changes, etc., you had to have both chambers agree to that. And how are we going to choose the members of the Congress? Well, the House of Representatives was to be chosen by eligible voters in the state, which is the democratic element of the government. Of course, that was limited. Voting was determined by the states, and the states at that time granted voting rights primarily to white men, and, well, I say primarily, but basically exclusively to white men. Yes. And they often also had a property requirement at that time, or some type of, you had to show that you owned some property or had a certain degree of wealth. The Senate would be appointed by the states, by the state legislatures, and we'll talk more about some of the significance of this. But now, of course, that's different. The Senate is elected by the people based on the 17th Amendment, but at the time, the Senate was appointed, which the senators were then representatives of the states. And finally, we're going to get into this more later, but we have this very interesting system of electing the president. They came up with a compromise on that. They chose not to have the legislature choose the president, but they also didn't want to have the people choose the president. So they came up with this very unique and bizarre system called the Electoral College, which we'll get much more into later. But basically, where the states would create a system where you would choose electors, and those electors would then choose the president. The judicial branch would be appointed by the president, but have to be approved by the Senate, where every state would again have an equal voice.
All right. So essentially, Mr. Phillips has already gone over the Great Compromise, and it's important to recall that both sides came with certain proposals, and of course, in the end, they met in the middle. I think it will be interesting as we move along when we look at the lower house, in particular, the House of Representatives, which is supposed to be representative of the will of the people, how that has become somewhat distorted as a result of gerrymandering and as well as capping the number of representatives that we have in the lower house to 435, but that will be for a later discussion. So, one other aspect to really sort of hone in on here is bicameralism. In other words, the benefits, if you will, of dividing the legislature into two houses as opposed to one. And we'll explore this further in class, but it is worth contemplating why they chose to go with this system and what are the virtues of having this system. Also contemplate what are some of the potential drawbacks of having, a bicameral or yet another house weigh in on topics and issues. And you can see here that ultimately one other, there's a big takeaway here, is having a working definition of the U.S. Constitution. In other words, what is it? Oftentimes students have a very generic, basic, incomplete idea of what the Constitution is. It's a, I know it, but I can't explain it moment often when asked. And we want to make sure that you actually can articulate a working definition of the U.S. Constitution. So let's look at what it actually is. Well, it's the primary law of the U.S. federal government, and it is the legal document of the United States that at the end of the day, if there is a document to cite or refer back to with respect to what is the ultimate legal answer to a particular dispute, that would be the Constitution. It's also noteworthy that the Constitution is sort of a blueprint, if you will, for the government and how it was structured. It describes the branches and their jurisdictions and how they interrelate. So I jump to the fourth bullet point if you're wondering where I'm going. But you'll also want to take note that it if you will, it lays out, I should say, basic rights of the citizens. So here, not only does it describe what the government can do and its powers, but it also makes clearer what the government is not allowed to do and the areas where citizens enjoy some freedoms from the infringement upon government intrusion. Note also that, if you will, that our Constitution is actually the oldest federal constitution in existence. So it's very much, a document that has changed over time, but it's also withstood the test of time. But there's certainly still things that perhaps can be improved upon. So the organization of the U.S. Constitution is as follows. There are 7 major articles. You definitely want to be familiar with the various articles of the Constitution. We'll go over here shortly how you can remember those, and we'll have mnemonic devices that we discuss in class and that you can go over again. But nonetheless, the articles are divided into sections that are then divided into clauses so that when we ask you to do work with the Constitution itself, which we will, you'll know how to navigate it. And here you can see the 7 articles and what they deal with. Articles 1, 2, and 3 are rather simple to remember because they basically follow the order in which John Locke, and we'll talk about we've talked about him already when we talked about the political philosophers, and he basically ranks the various branches in terms of their importance. And so the most important branch is the legislative branch. So the very first article, and the article that is the longest article, if I believe, then that deals with the legislative branch because it was the first most important, right? Primary. And it was if it's most important, we are going to spend the most time detailing, describing, and discussing it. Article 2 is the second most important branch according to Locke, and thereby the founding fathers, and that's the executive branch. And Article 3 is the least dangerous or weakest of the branches, and that is the judicial branch. Now, Article 4, oftentimes I tell my students, think all for one and one for all, so that it can sort of prime their mind to think about a large group of entities. In this case, the idea here, Article 4, looks into, or if you will, details states' relationships with one another and how they interact with one another. you'll see here the various rights and guarantees by the federal government as well. Article 5, it's a fun article. One of my students came up with this mnemonic device. But if you hold your hand out with all 5 hands extended, right, making a sign that says fingers extended, sorry, that says stop, the way the student sort of articulated the idea behind Article 5 is, since Article 5 deals with the amendment process, meaning changes or making changes to the Constitution, if you held your hand out with all 5 fingers extended, obviously Article 5, and you said, stop, don't come in, I'm changing, that was a silly way of remembering, or a perhaps helpful way of remembering. Article 5 deals with amending or changing. It's just mnemonic devices, students, if you don't already know, is the better ones are the funny ones, and because you're more likely to remember them. And
That was news to me, I must admit. I hadn't heard that story before, so.
and he'll remember
I'm
it from here
chuckling now.
on. Yeah, fair enough. Finally, Article 6 is the supremacy clause. In this case, I don't have a great mnemonic device there other than if you're familiar with the Supremes in the 60s and supremacy, but nonetheless, come up with one that makes sense for you. But essentially, it underscores the idea, or this article sort of focuses in on the idea that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In other words, if there happens to be a conflict between the Constitution and a state law, the Constitution will prevail as long as the Constitution or the federal law is applicable in that domain. And finally, Article 7 deals with the ratification process, the finalization process, if you will. And since there are only 7 articles and Article 7 is the final of the 7 articles, it's convenient, if you will, that ratification also means finalization. So Article 7 deals with the finalization of any changes, and that's the ratification process.
Just one historical note quickly. For Article 7, one thing to note is they do require 9 states to ratify the Constitution. Once 9 of the 13 original states ratified, the Constitution would take effect, which sort of was a lesson learned from the Articles of Confederation, which it took 4 years, over 4 years, I believe, to get those ratified because all the states had to agree to it. Okay, so this is, we're going to go over in more detail in class the idea of the 2 groups. So the country after the Constitution was released, remember it was drafted in secret. They did not reveal any of their negotiations or proposals to the public until they were completely finished with the document. And so it's released to the public and they get the first view of this. And the country is very sharply divided over whether or not to approve this Constitution, whether or not the delegates did a good job at the convention. And of course, remember, they weren't supposed to come out with a new Constitution in the first place. And so who were these 2 competing groups? Well,
one of those groups were the Federalists. The 2 basic camps, and this will be simple, were the Federalists, who were in favor of a stronger federal or central government. In other words, they were in favor of the new Constitution that had just been drafted. And they set about trying to convince, defend, and persuade the public that this new document that set up a federal republic was a good thing. And so I stress the word federal as a proxy for the word central government so as to, again, make that association between the Federalists being in favor of a stronger federal government as it articulated and as designed by the new Constitution. So they were in favor of the U.S. Constitution. And the persons in particular in this group who had made it their business to try and persuade people were James Madison, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, who wrote under the pen name Publius, and they would release these papers to the various outlets so as to, again, explain to the people that what they had crafted was actually virtuous and good and would help remedy some of the major problems they were suffering under the Articles of Confederation. And you can see here that these Federalist Papers were considered authoritative but unofficial. Now, authoritative but unofficial. Why is that? Well, they're authoritative because Madison, John Jay, and Hamilton, they were all, of course, present when designing the Constitution, so they definitely have every right to help to explain what it is they helped craft. But it's unofficial because they clearly did not constitute everyone who was present at the Constitutional Convention, and so they cannot mean to speak for everyone at the convention in terms of the rationale they were forwarding. So that's why we consider the Federalist Papers authoritative but unofficial explanation of American government by those who created it. The other camp were the Anti-Federalists. One moment, sorry. We apologize. But I left you with the statement that the Anti-Federalists would require from the Federalists something before they were willing to sign off on this Constitution, and that was the Bill of Rights. And if you look at the Bill of Rights, those are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. So notice that since they're amendments, they're not originally part of the U.S. constitutional document, right? They're amended, they're added after the fact. And so really the Anti-Federalists had to really trust the word of the Federalists that they would in fact do as they said, which was to include or agree to ratify these first 10 amendments known as the Bill of Rights. And if you look at the Bill of Rights as a whole, they essentially are the freedoms that we as citizens individually enjoy from government intrusion. They really sort of delimit and rather establish a boundary across which the government is not allowed to interfere. And so therefore, this could help allay some of the Anti-Federalists' fears that this new government would somehow become too domineering and overwhelm them and their rights and liberties. Now here we have two theories, one by Roche and the other one by Beard. And yeah, you do need to know this. I think it's important to understand who was making and crafting and framing the Constitution. I think oftentimes, especially now that we are so far removed from the actual years when the Constitution was crafted, we sort of just toss it up to this, this was something that happened and it was meant to happen, and we don't really question who crafted it. We sometimes have this view that those who crafted it did everything perfectly, and we should just not question it. And I think it's helpful to understand that these were men, and as men, they are flawed, and they knew they were flawed. And it's also important to remember that the Founding Fathers didn't all agree with each other on everything, as we just got finished discussing with the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. So to pretend that somehow this document, the Constitution, was somehow written in stone and was meant to be a finite, final product is misleading and inaccurate. So it's important to explore perhaps what the motivations were and who the people were that crafted the Constitution. And Beard presents a very interesting look. And he says, essentially, if you want to understand in other words, why the Constitution was crafted the way it was and what kind of principles it stressed and which kind of principles it didn't stress, you can essentially look at it from an economic perspective, meaning that if you looked at all the persons who crafted the Constitution, they were all white, male, landowning elite. And therefore, you're going to see a document that protects property, that protects their business interests. And so you'll see that some of the most important clauses in the Constitution, in fact, perhaps do help protect and insulate, or rather reinforce the sort of power structure that was in place to protect their property and their belongings. Namely, I'm thinking of the contract clause, where contracts were considered sacred, that once you entered into them, not even the states, little, and really not much of the national government could do to change them if you entered into them without any other duress or other conditions that would have compromised your your good faith agreement to enter into that contract. But that's a very interesting idea, that a lot of what the Constitution is a document that protects the interest of the landed elite, I should say. And it sort of makes sense too when you think about why the Constitutional Convention happened anyway, right? Or in the first place. Remember when we talked about Shays' Rebellion and the motivation and the reason for why the Constitutional Convention was started. Roche, on the other hand, suggests that really we just need to look at the Constitution as the byproduct of practical politicians who were trying to reach compromises to get to agreement, if you will, among themselves, that essentially, we don't need to sort of ascribe any ulterior motives to the founding fathers, that instead you can see this as the product of various individuals who gave thoughtful consideration to things and who were obviously self-interested to some extent too, but who needed to reach some compromise. And that essentially that's what we got, was a document full of compromises where neither side got everything they wanted.
Okay, so we're going to discuss, again, some of this more in class, but in the Constitution, there's various delineation of powers between the national and state government, some exclusive to one or the other, some exclusive to the national government, others not mentioned to the national government, reserved to the states, some powers exercised at both levels, and so forth. So we're going to look at these different terms and what they mean in terms of federal powers, state powers, and national powers. This chart here lists some of those powers that exist at each level, but again, we're going to look at that together in more detail, so we'll get to that later. So, here we go. To understand federalism, we're going to break it down into these different powers. Of course, we will come back to this. We will discuss this also in another PowerPoint on federalism, which I'm sure you'll also look forward to watching. But let's start with expressed powers or enumerated powers. I think I'll maybe let Mr. Davila take this one.
So, again, hearkening back to our prior discussion about how the Constitution came to be, that one of the primary concerns, even among the Federalists, were that they didn't want to create a federal government or a central government that was too powerful. So they went to great lengths to try and craft a document that would limit the powers of the central government, but make it powerful enough to do the things it needed to do to run a large country or nation. So these were the powers that were explicitly, I'm going to try to use some alliteration here, were explicitly enumerated in the document. And so they were actually physically written. You can look at them. They are there in the document itself. They're specifically listed. Some examples of these enumerated powers include the power to tax, the power to declare and wage war, the power to raise an army or navy, to borrow money, to make treaties, to coin money, to regulate trade and make rules for immigration, and so on. I also want to stress here that these powers in large part also were responses to the weaknesses that were seen in the Articles of Confederation. In other words, the fact that under the Articles of Confederation, the central government could not tax, if you will, without could not tax at all, the inability to raise those revenues on their own without being beholden to the states really undermined the ability of the national government to do its work. So what the founding fathers then did when they were crafting the Constitution, a lot of these enumerated powers were specifically incorporated or included as responses to, or in a way to address, the weaknesses they saw in the Articles of Confederation. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. In either event, one last thing I wanted to mention here is that one of the particular clauses that the Congress is able to use to expand its power tremendously under this necessary and proper language is also known as the elastic clause, for that matter, because elastic has this elasticity quality, right? This is sort of ability to expand. In this case, Congress has been able to use the Interstate Commerce Clause to great effect in terms of expanding its power. So I want you to remember that in particular, while it is true that there are various parts of the Constitution that have been used to imply or further expand the powers of Congress, few have reached the level of, or if you will, the significance of the Interstate Commerce Clause. And we'll discuss that later on, but I want you to remember that here. So the reserve powers, what are they? They're basically the powers that, if you will, have not been given to the federal government or the central government, and therefore have been left to the states. So everything that had not been enumerated or could not be reasonably inferred as necessary and proper, and is the proper domain of a government to carry out or use or to execute, those then, or that area, or those powers are then reserved for the states. In particular, we're looking here, I think, at three major areas. So I always come up with this acronym MEE, M-E-E. It's not a perfect way of remembering it, but it is a way of remembering it. But the reason I say that is because the three major areas, it's not that it's only these areas, but the three major areas that states exercise sole authority are marriage, education, and elections. So these three areas are the domains or the proper domains reserved to the states.
Okay, so yeah, and we have our 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment basically says powers not granted to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people. Of course, also the powers cannot be denied. So that's one other thing to add is, remember, a power, if it's denied to the states, that would not fall under reserve powers. For example, coining money. All right, so concurrent powers or shared powers are powers that are exercised at both the national and the state level separately or sometimes cooperatively. So concurrent meaning happening at the same time. So what are some powers that are exercised at the national level? So they would be enumerated, but also can be exercised at the state level in their own domain. And so examples would be build roads, borrow money, lay and collect taxes, set up court systems, make and enforce laws. So for example, of course, we have federal roads like interstates, and we have state roads like, Roswell Road. We have national government can borrow money and the states can borrow money on their own. We have national taxes like income tax, and we have state taxes, state income tax or state sales tax, etc. So you get the point.
The denied powers are those powers denied to the national, state, and frankly, both or any government. Basically, these are the powers that the people, frankly, are able to exercise, or areas that the government cannot, if you will, infringe upon. These are the things, in other words, that the government is not allowed to do under the Constitution under any circumstances. The examples include ex post facto laws, bills of attainder, taxing foreign exports or goods traded between states. States cannot issue their own currency, etc. In particular, if we're looking here at ex post facto laws, those are laws that would have been made after the fact. For example, punishing people for something they didn't know was against the law is seen as inherently unjust and unfair, and a method by which governments could become very abusive. In fact, one of the reasons this law had, or this stipulation was included, is because you saw especially monarchical governments like that of Britain, and under George III, under which the colonies were subject. They in fact often abuse these powers where they would punish or penalize enemies by passing laws after the fact and being able to justify jailing, killing, or otherwise abusing people. So ex post facto laws, no government on any level was allowed to do that. In other words, they weren't allowed to pass laws after the fact. In the case of bills of attainder, this is basically something that's not typically used now, but essentially large groups of people or persons in mass would be denied, if you will, basic due process rights, and they would essentially just be put into jail without any sort of process afforded to them.
Right. I mean, basically that the government can't pass a law passing judgment on a group of people or punishment on a group of people. That's the proper role of the courts and juries, not the Congress.
You saw this used oftentimes in times of war, where large groups of persons, their due process rights would be suspended, or they would just essentially been directly put into jail without any sort of trial.
And most of these others are pretty self-explanatory, that our government does not have the power to tax exports. The U.S. Congress can tax imports, but not exports coming out of the country. You cannot have a tax on goods traded between the states, no federal taxes on interstate commerce. And the states, there's many powers denied specifically to the states, such as issuing currency, entering into treaties with foreign governments, and so forth.
And remember, the reason for that is because the Constitution was largely a document drafted to respond to the weaknesses and the inequities, or if you will, the failures of the Articles of Confederation, one of which was having no single currency or really mechanism to enforce a single currency. So understand these denied powers within that context.
Okay, so we're going to go through, we're getting close here, but we're going to go through some of these clauses. These are very important. And so let's start, we're going to look at some of the clauses that are in the Constitution. This is not, a complete list. This is just some of the key clauses.
The Supremacy Clause we talked about already in Article 6, if you remember when we were going over the articles and remembering ways to remember it. But essentially the idea here is that the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land. In other words, if there's a situation where both the federal law and the state law or a local law are applicable and in conflict, the federal law will prevail. And
well, I was going to say that one example I use, maybe this is like an old man thing, but maybe you guys don't do this. but there's a fun card game I used to play called Spades, and in a lot of card games, there's trump cards, right? And as the name suggests, in Spades, the trump card is spades. Well, if you typically play spades with 4 people, if you play a spade and everyone else plays a different suit, you would win that hand. Now, the ultimate card in the game of spades is the ace of spades. The ace of spades beats every other card. If you play the ace of spades, you are guaranteed to win that hand. Now, why do I say this? Well, the analogy I make here is that the Constitution in our political system, if the political system is like a card game, there's the show House of Cards, then the U.S. Constitution is the ace of spades. It trumps, no pun intended, it trumps everything. It beats everything. And therefore, nothing can go against the Constitution. Laws of Congress cannot conflict with the Constitution. Laws of the states, laws of the local governments, judicial rulings, nothing can go against the Constitution. But also notice it says, and the laws of the United States which shall be made in pursuance thereof. And I think that's pretty clear, but of course, some of the states still don't agree with this, but that laws passed, rightfully under the Constitution are also supreme over, as Mr. Dowell said, over the states. So if they're in conflict, if you have a law of Congress that is in conflict with a state law, the U.S. law trumps the state law.
We have here the necessary and proper clause. Remember that this clause in particular was essential with respect to the expansion of the enumerated powers, otherwise known as the implied powers. So I want you to make a strong association here of the necessary and proper clause with the implied powers. In other words, those powers that are deemed to be necessary and proper for the Congress to carry out its enumerated powers. And so remember that there's an elasticity to this clause because, again, we're expanding the powers of the federal government beyond just those that are specifically written out. The Interstate Commerce Clause, if you remember, I told you when we were talking about the implied powers, is the most important in terms of, or I should say, the U.S. Congress has gotten the most mileage, pun intended, out of the Interstate Commerce Clause when it comes to expanding its enumerated powers. So this particular clause has been responsible for much of the expansion or much of the growth in the area of implied powers of the U.S. Congress.
All right, so we'll see, for example, this comes into play when we talk later in the semester about segregation, how the U.S. government bans segregation in public places, and they use interstate commerce to justify the passage of that law. You see it with pollution laws, air pollution, water pollution. Why is Congress able to pass laws telling the states that they must uphold certain environmental regulations, although some of those have been definitely erased recently, but
eroded.
But yeah, I mean that again, interstate commerce, because pollution, is sort of the result of commercial activity, and it also crosses state lines. Pollution in one state can affect another state, therefore the federal government can get involved. Laws on broadcasting, regulation of what's on television, what's on the radio, can be justified by the Interstate Commerce Clause. Banking laws, minimum wage laws, workers' rights, all of these things, Congress has made laws over the course of our history, and states may say, why can you tell us why we have to do these? Why do we have to follow these federal regulations? There's nothing in the Constitution that specifically gives you that power. No, it's implied.
Contract clause is a very important clause. If you recall when I was talking to you about Beard's theory about why the Constitution was framed the way it was, and he said, look at the economic motives of the people who were making it. And I said, I would suggest to you that one of the pieces of evidence he could point to here is the emphasis and the power behind the contract clause. Essentially, you'll see here that the framers and the Constitution regard contracts as rather sacred, things that apply as between private individuals or contracts made by state government, that these cannot be tinkered or manipulated or, if you will, done away with by states or federal governments. In other words, it's extremely a high bar to be able to change the terms of a contract as long as the individuals or the individual in the state have entered into, or the entities have entered into the contract in good faith and they were not under duress. That means they weren't having a gun held up to them or they weren't being somehow manipulated in a unjust or illegal way. That contract is valid, and there's very little that can be done to undo that contract. And if you can imagine that if you are a person who's in business or who's wealthy, this matters a lot to you because you can depend on a contract that you make being enforced, right? So if you're running a businesses enjoy predictability. You'll often hear that in markets. They like predictable or stable markets. In other words, they want to make sure that, when you've signed a contract saying you're going to pay them back, $100,000 for this quantity of goods, that in fact you will be paying them that amount of money and that won't change, so that they can then make future plans about how to invest that money. They can rely on that money being there, or they can rely on those goods getting to them. If they're the ones paying for a good, they can rely that that good in fact will be delivered or service rendered. The full faith and credit clause is a holdover from the Articles of Confederation as well. We'll talk about the privileges and immunities, it's in there as well. The basic idea here is that each state has to recognize and honor the public acts, records, and especially, this was key for this, for especially judicial proceedings of every other state. In other words, if you had been accused of, and if you will, successfully prosecuted for a violation of a law in one state, and let's say that you then fled to another state, that state didn't have the choice of not giving you back over to the state from which you fled, or failing to recognize that you, in fact, were someone who indeed has a crime on their record. In other words, there was an emphasis here on states recognizing the valid legal judgments of other states. Did you want to add an example? You had a good. Well, you had a good example.
Well, I said, for instance, if you were ordered to pay, say, child support, let's say a mother gets custody of children, but the father, after divorce, is ordered by a judge to pay a certain amount in child support. He can't move, from Georgia to South Carolina and then suddenly say, well, now I don't owe child support because that was an order by a Georgia judge. So the legal authorities in South Carolina would also recognize that as an obligation. The last one I believe here is the Republican form of government clause, and this is basically just saying that the United States will guarantee that each state will have a Republican form of government, and so therefore, if say one person Mr. Davila tries to take over the government of Georgia and establish a dictatorship under his leadership,
which would be a vast improvement.
Then the U.S. government could intervene and overthrow the Davila dictatorship and reestablish our excellent Republican Georgia government.
You mean utopia? Okay.
Yes.
This would be
go on. So yes, this hasn't really come into play as far as I know, but this is just guaranteeing that notion that every state will have a government that is elected by the people, representatives of the people. Our last big topic here is going to be looking at the methods of proposing the constitutional amendments, which again is Article 5. Stop, I'm changing.
Don't
I like
come
that. So we're going to skip over some of these slides here, but you can look at these on your own. But we're going to skip ahead to a chart, which I think effectively shows the four methods. There's essentially two ways to propose and two ways to ratify an amendment. So let's skip ahead. Okay, and so here we see the four methods. You see step one and step two. So there's two ways to propose an amendment, two methods outlined in the Constitution for proposing an amendment, a change to the Constitution. And then there's two possible ways to ratify or approve that amendment. Notice how the first step is a sort of a national element, right? The national government or a national voice in amending the Constitution. The second one is a voice at the state level. So this also demonstrates what we'll talk more about later, which is federalism, the notion that the national and the state governments play a role in changing the U.S. Constitution. Now, the two methods at the top there, those are the most commonly used methods here. That is, amendment would be proposed by a 2/3 vote of the House and Senate, so not combined, but they'd have to reach a 2/3, 67%, I guess, essentially threshold of votes in the House and in the Senate. That has happened with all 27 of our current amendments. It started in this way. So in other words, a national convention held, after requests by 2/3 of the state has never been used for amending the Constitution. But that is a possibility. Now, the second step would be at the state level. So you see, if you go straight across from 2/3 of the vote of both houses, then it would be sent to the various states. Each state would receive a copy of the proposed amendment, and the state legislatures could vote on that and approve it. But it would take 3/4 of the states, 38 states currently, would have to vote, majority vote of their state legislatures to approve that amendment. That's happened for 26 of our 27 amendments. There was one amendment, the 21st Amendment, which was abolishing or repealing the 18th Amendment on prohibition of alcohol, was passed by the method you see in the bottom right corner, which is conventions of the people would be held in each state, similar to the way the Constitution itself was ratified, and that would take approval also by 3/4 of those conventions.
I want to add one other thing here. It's important to see the fractions here. I'm going to give you a mnemonic device to help you remember how these fractions work. So if you look at the two on the left, the amendments, how to propose an amendment in the first place, I want you to remember which article of the Constitution deals with amending. That's Article 5. Article 5 deals with the amendment process. And so if you look at the fraction 2/3, if you add 2 plus 3, it equals 5. That's right. So Article 5 then here, when we're talking about the proposal of an amendment, we're looking at the fractions 2/3, and that's the magic number there. And remember to associate it with its sum, which is 5. Article 5 deals with amending. So 2/3 is key there. Now, with respect to ratification, which article deals with ratification? Article 7, right? So I think you can see where I'm going here. When we talk about the steps dealing with ratifying or finalizing an amendment, then you can see that 3/4, if you say 3 plus 4 equals 7, right? It corresponds to Article 7. So it's a clever mnemonic device to help you remember these fractions because they will be important to distinguish here, and it's one helpful way to do that.
Okay, so I believe our final point here is informal amendments. So oftentimes the Constitution is essentially changed without formally going through the process we just outlined. Of course, these are called informal because the Constitution is not officially changed, but it has the effect of an amendment. Of course, it's not quite as lasting, perhaps, as an actual written amendment, but it's still very influential. So informal amendments can take place in several ways, as you see here. One would be passage of legislation. So, for instance, Congress is given the power to create all federal courts below the Supreme Court. So every time, essentially, they create a new court, like military courts, circuit courts, etc., which we'll talk about later, they are essentially changing the structure, adding to the structure of our government, therefore amending essentially the Constitution in a way. Passing laws on civil rights, defining people's rights to vote and to access employment and so forth. is essentially granting new rights, not by an amendment, but by law.
You can see that actions taken by the president as well can constitute an informal way of changing or expanding if you will, powers of the executive. In this case, presidents can utilize executive agreements or executive orders. In the case of executive agreements, this allows presidents to make, if you will, agreements with foreign nations without the approval of the Senate. Now, typically, the process would be crafting a treaty, but the treaty would require Senate approval. But in this case, the president is able to circumvent or sidestep the Senate altogether in this process to expedite or speed up or make quicker the process of drafting and crafting agreements as between two nations. You can see the War Powers Act, if you will, the war powers of the president, that during times of war, Congress has given the president the ability to set, or I should say not during times of war, pardon, that during a conflict, sometimes the president will be allowed to send troops overseas for a number of days without congressional declaration of war. And so this was definitely an expansion and a change to what were the powers given to the president under the Constitution. Executive orders also allows the president to, if you will, put his own interpretation, his or her own interpretation on how a law should be carried out. So in these ways, the president has also been able to expand their powers beyond what the Constitution had originally explicitly envisioned or enumerated.
And then, of course, you have the Supreme Court and other federal courts who can make rulings that essentially help define our rights, right? So the Roe v. Wade, which we'll talk about some of these cases, Roe v. Wade, which basically made abortion a legal right in America. And that was not ever written into the Constitution. It was an interpretation of the Constitution using the power of judicial review, and in that case, striking down a Texas law that banned abortion in most cases. Gay marriage, to the Obergefell case, I've heard it pronounced different ways, but which, of course, granted the right in all states for same-sex marriage. And that was a right now created by the Supreme Court. Again, these are informal, so the Supreme Court could change their mind on these things. It's not as solid as a formal amendment.
So the Supreme Court's more expansive or narrow interpretation of wording or ideas in the Constitution can effectively change the meaning of the Constitution. Moving on to the activities of political parties, for example, you see that primaries are held and national conventions are held every 4 years. Well, primaries are held more often than that, but the conventions are held every 4 years to correspond with the election and nomination, formal nomination of a presidential candidate. The point being driven here is that some of these processes become part of the fabric of our Constitution, or if you will, our government, in terms of their traditions and how long they've been in existence. Also, the fact is that political parties are the two dominant political parties, to be more specific, are the dominant entities in our government. And so a lot of their protocol, a lot of their custom, a lot of their tradition becomes more formal, if you will, and part of the fabric of our Constitution.
And finally, we have custom, sort of tradition, the cabinet, for instance, the fact that we have now 15 cabinet level departments that, have been enshrined by law, but the cabinet itself came about as a custom. George Washington, asked for Congress to create these 4 executive departments, and they became some of his top advisors, the heads of these departments, and that tradition has been continued throughout our history. Senatorial courtesy is the notion that presidents typically consult with senators from the state in which a judicial nomination is to take place. especially for the lower federal courts.
Well, and we know that because these are informal amendments, sometimes these particular practices are honored and respected, and other times they are not.
Okay. So I think that wraps up our presentation here. So I hope you guys learned something here, and we will see you later.